The radiator in the corner of my office had been clicking since October, and by February I'd stopped hearing it. The same way I'd stopped noticing the stack of files on my left, the chipped edge of my keyboard, the exact angle of afternoon light that came through the frosted glass partition at 3:47 p.m. You spend enough time somewhere and it stops being a place. It just becomes the air you breathe. I'd been at Harrogate Capital for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. Not that I was counting. My desk sat outside Sebastian Voss's office like a border crossing. Everything that came in or went out passed through me first. Documents, phone calls, catered lunches with men who never made eye contact with the person handing them their coffee. I was the last line between Sebastian and whatever the world decided to throw at him that morning, and I was good at it. Better than good. I'd learned to anticipate problems the way you learn to read weather. Not by checking the forecast, but by the feeling in your bones before the clouds even form. Sebastian Voss ran one of the most significant private investment firms in Toronto. Legitimate on the surface, and mostly below it too, though the edges were blurred in ways I'd trained myself not to examine too closely. He had offices in the Exchange Tower, with a view that made people feel smaller than they were, and he used that view deliberately. I'd seen it happen dozens of times. Someone sitting across from him, trying to hold their ground, and then their eyes would drift to the city stretched out behind him, and something in them would shift. He knew exactly what he was doing. I knew exactly what I was doing too. That was the thing about this job. You couldn't survive it by being oblivious. You survived it by being precise. My name is Vera. I was 28 when all of this started, which felt young until it stopped feeling young at all. I wore my dark hair in a knot I'd perfected over 18 months of trial and error. Tight enough to look professional, loose enough that I didn't get headaches by noon. I owned 4 pairs of the same black trousers because I'd made my peace with the fact that I would always spill coffee on at least 1 pair per week, and I refused to spend my mornings in crisis. That kind of practical efficiency was probably the main reason I'd lasted longer in this position than anyone before me. Sebastian had gone through 3 assistants in the year before I was hired. The first lasted 6 weeks, the second 4 months. The third walked out mid-shift on a Thursday, and nobody spoke about her after that. When I interviewed, the HR coordinator, a tired-looking woman named Paulette, who clearly didn't expect much from the process, had said almost apologetically that Mr. Voss had particular standards. I'd looked her directly in the eye and told her I had particular standards too. She'd blinked. Then she'd called me that same afternoon. He was difficult in ways that had nothing to do with cruelty. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't take credit for other people's work or make the junior analysts cry. What he did was expect perfection without explaining what perfection looked like, and somehow I'd managed to figure it out anyway. Through observation, through failure, through quietly rebuilding the filing architecture of his entire calendar in my first month, because the previous system was, to put it charitably, a disaster. He hadn't thanked me for it, but he'd stopped double-checking my scheduling after that, which from Sebastian Voss was practically a standing ovation. The thing about working that close to someone, close enough that you know which elevator button they press before they reach for it, close enough that you can hear the specific quality of silence that means they're 3 minutes from ending a call, is that you start to build a picture of them that nobody else has. Not the version he showed investors, not the version his lawyers dealt with. The real texture of someone, what they read when they're tired, how they hold their shoulders differently when they're worried, what they never, ever talk about, even when they're talking about everything else. I knew, for instance, that he kept a photograph in his top desk drawer that he looked at on bad days. I'd seen it once, accidentally, when he'd asked me to pull a file. An older woman with Sebastian's same direct eyes, sitting on a dock somewhere in what looked like Muskoka. He closed the drawer the moment he noticed me looking, and we never mentioned it. That was the climate I operated in. Careful, precise, and very good at not asking about things I'd already understood. The flowers arrived on a Tuesday. I was recalculating the variance on a partner presentation when the front desk called up. "Miss Vera, there's a delivery, personal for you." I assumed it was the printer cartridges I'd ordered for the secondary machine, which kept cycling out around this time of month. I didn't look up from my screen. Leave it at reception, I'll grab it at lunch. It's not that kind of delivery. There were 24 dahlias, white with plum-colored centers, arranged in a wide-necked glass vase that was probably worth more than my work shoes. The card was cream-colored cardstock, handwritten in a clean architectural script. For the woman who makes Tuesday feel like something worth looking forward to. No name, no return address on the florist card beyond a boutique I didn't recognize on King Street West. I stood there for a moment in the lobby, coat still half on, looking at these flowers like they'd appeared from another dimension. Mr. Voss noticed them when he came through. The front desk attendant, a young guy named Ben who was very earnest about his job, told me in a low voice, as though imparting sensitive intelligence. He asked who they were for. I carried them upstairs. I didn't know what else to do with them. Sebastienne was in a call when I got back. I set the flowers on the corner of my desk, out of the way, and tried to remember where I'd been in the variance analysis. I was halfway back into the spreadsheet when his door opened. He stood in the doorway. He did that sometimes, stood in the doorway without announcing what he wanted, as if he was deciding something. He was wearing a charcoal suit that had been pressed that morning and would still look that way at midnight. Dark brown hair, a jaw that looked like it had been designed to make contract negotiations uncomfortable for the other side. His eyes were the specific shade of gray that weather apps describe incorrectly. The flowers. Apparently, someone sent them to me, apparently. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, his arms crossing in a way that read as casual but wasn't. Who? I don't know, there's no name on the card. A pause. Read me the card. I did. I kept my voice professional. He listened with an expression I couldn't fully categorize, something sitting between controlled and carefully contained. Throw them out. I looked up. Sorry? The flowers. Get rid of them. The heat that moved up the back of my neck wasn't quite embarrassment and wasn't quite something else. They're addressed to me, Mr. Voss. This is my office. My desk is outside your office. I held his gaze. The flowers are on my desk. The silence had texture. Have them removed from the floor, he said finally, and walked back into his office and closed the door. And I sat there for a long moment, doing absolutely nothing productive, while pretending to do something productive. I didn't throw them out. I took them down to the 8th floor kitchen at lunch and left them on the counter with a note that said, "Please enjoy, Vera." And I told myself the thing sitting in my chest was nothing more than irritation at being ordered around about my own personal belongings, which was true, mostly. My friend Demi, she worked in compliance 2 floors up and had strong opinions about everything, which I found deeply comforting, came by at 12:30 to find me staring at a soup I wasn't eating. "You look like someone ran over your hypothesis," she said, which was how Demi offered concern. I told her about the flowers. She immediately produced the expression of someone who had been waiting for this exact news. "He told you to throw them out. He said to have them removed from the floor, which is the same thing, but more dramatic." She sat across from me. "And you have no idea who sent them? Could it be from someone inside the firm?" I thought about it. I thought about who knew my full name and which department I worked in. The answer was, most people in the building, technically. Harrogate Capital had about 180 employees across 3 floors. I knew many of them by face, if not by name. "There's someone in structured finance," Demi said, her voice dropping half an octave into what I privately called her situation analysis register. "You know the one. Tall, well-dressed, keeps showing up at firm events you also attend. Demi, Lachlan something. Lachlan. Do not finish that sentence. I'm aware of who you mean." The truth was I'd noticed him, the way you notice anything that's slightly off about a room you're comfortable in. And I don't think it's him. Why not? Because the handwriting on that card was too deliberate, I thought. Too considered. It wasn't the handwriting of someone who'd dashed something off between meetings. It was the handwriting of someone who'd thought about it. I didn't say any of this to Demi. I said, just a feeling, and changed the subject, and tried not to think about the fact that Sebastian Voss had asked to have the flowers removed within 4 minutes of seeing them. The week proceeded. I didn't receive anything else. I half convinced myself it had been a misdirection. Someone's assistant had gotten the floor wrong, maybe. Some other Vera, somewhere in the tower, felt vaguely cheated out of nice flowers. Then on Friday morning, I got an email. Personal account, not work. The subject line was blank. The body read, I hope the dahlias weren't too much. I wasn't sure about white, but then I remembered you always wear at least one thing without color, and I thought you might appreciate the restraint. N. My hands went still over the keyboard. N. I read it 3 times. Whoever this was, they'd been watching me. Not casually. The detail about what I wore, that was specific. That was observational in a way that crossed a line between noticing and something else. I forwarded it to my personal notes. I didn't respond. That afternoon, Sebastian called me into his office over the intercom. Not for a task. That much was clear from the way he said my name. He was standing at the window when I came in, hands in his pockets, watching the financial district like it owed him something, which in some sense it did. Close the door, please. I did. The email you received this afternoon. He turned to face me. My stomach dropped precisely 6 floors. How do you know about that? Because your email went through the firm's server before routing to your personal account. You used the firm guest Wi-Fi when you logged in this morning. His expression was even, factual. I have security alerts set on anything involving your accounts that originate from company infrastructure. It's a standard protocol. That sounds like a privacy violation. It sounds like one, he agreed, without apologizing for it. The sender signed off as N. Does that mean anything to you? No. He moved from the window to the desk, and I was aware, not for the first time, of how he occupied space differently than most people. Not aggressively, just, completely, like the room adjusted to him rather than the other way around. He picked up a folder from his desk and turned it toward me. A photograph. A man leaving a restaurant I recognized on Wellington, maybe early 40s, dark hair, dressed with the kind of tailoring that got called, understated in profiles and expensive everywhere else. Neil Cavendish. His family runs a shipping logistics company out of Halifax, with significant operations through Ontario. Legitimate on the surface. And below it? Below it, he facilitates the movement of goods through Canadian ports using inspection loopholes that he's been cultivating through relationships with port administrators for about a decade. Nothing that's been successfully prosecuted. Everything that's been carefully structured to stay just outside clean. He looked at me steadily. His interest in you isn't romantic, Vera. Or if it isn't only that. I sat down in the chair across from his desk, which I didn't usually do uninvited. He didn't comment on it. He knows where I work. He's been in the building. Twice, in the last 3 months, for third-party meetings on the tenant floors. He would have had access to the directory. He'd have known your name and your position. And he thought. I stopped. He thinks I have access to your transaction records. To specific shipping contracts. The firm handles logistics financing for 3 major port operators, including one in Halifax, where Cavendish has been trying to establish new inspection relationships. He's been blocked twice through administrative channels. If he had access to our client contact list, who we deal with, what leverage points exist, he could find a different angle in. I absorbed this. You've been watching him. I've been aware of him. The distinction in Sebastian's voice was small but real. Since September, when he appeared at a fundraising dinner for the Harborfront Center. You were there volunteering for the event setup. He spent 11 minutes in your vicinity and asked 2 people in your orbit what your name was. 11 minutes, he'd counted. What do you want me to do? I asked. Nothing yet. He moved around the desk and stood a careful 2 feet from where I was sitting, which with Sebastian Voss was practically intimate. But I want you to tell me immediately if he contacts you again. Don't respond. Don't delete anything. And Vera, my name in his mouth, not my title, landed differently than I expected. Lock your laptop when you leave your desk. Even for 30 seconds, I already do. Something crossed his face. Yes, you do. He looked at me for a moment longer than the conversation required. That's all. I stood. I was almost at the door when he spoke again. The dahlias. Where did they end up? 8th floor kitchen. A pause. That was a better decision than throwing them in the bin. I didn't turn around. Was that an apology, Mr. Voss? It was an observation. I left. I stood in the elevator for 4 floors with my eyes closed, breathing carefully, and told myself that whatever was sitting in my sternum was nothing complicated. Niall Cavendish emailed again on Sunday evening. I'd like to take you to dinner, somewhere decent. You strike me as someone who'd appreciate that. Tuesday works well for me, if it works for you. I'll have a car sent. Still no question mark. Still the comfortable assumption of a man who'd never been told no in a way that inconvenienced him. I screenshot it and texted it to Sebastian's direct line before I could second-guess myself. His response came in 4 minutes. Don't answer, I'll call you in the morning. He called at 7:43, before I'd even reached the office. He's escalating. The pattern is consistent with someone who's working a timeline. He's been building this for months, and now he's moving faster. Sebastian's voice had that particular quality it had during high-pressure negotiations. Controlled in a way that made you aware of what was being controlled. I'd like to talk through a strategy. Come in early if you can. I was already on the subway. The conference room he used for sensitive conversations was on the 29th floor, different from his office, closer to the firm's legal counsel suite. It was the kind of room that knew how to keep a secret. He had coffee ready, which was unusual. He never made coffee for meetings. He made it for conversations. I sat across from him with my coat still on because the room was cold, and he slid a folder across the table without preamble. 3 months ago, Cavendish lost a bid to expand his port administrative contacts through the Nova Scotia Port Authority. The administrator who blocked him, Gerald Finch, is a client of ours. Our relationship with Finch goes through 3 shipping contracts that touch your desk. Cavendish knows this. He thinks if he gets information from me about how we're structured, about who Finch answers to through us, he can find a workaround. I opened the folder. Photographs, correspondence summaries, timelines. He's not trying to charm me. He's trying to acquire me, more or less. Sebastian's jaw shifted slightly. I became aware of his interest in you before I told you. I should have said something sooner. I looked up. In 2 years, I had never heard him begin a sentence with I should have. Why didn't you? Because I thought I could resolve it without pulling you into it. A pause. I was wrong. I held his gaze. Something in the air of the room had changed. Or maybe it had always been this and I'd spent 2 years learning to ignore it. What do you need from me? I need you to respond to his dinner invitation, a beat. You want me to go, with protocols in place, monitored, with a security presence you won't see but will be there. You'd go, let him make his approach, and we'd document the offer when he makes it. And he will make it. That's what the dinner's for. His voice was measured, deliberate. But I want you to know that if you say no, I'll find another way to handle this. I'm not asking you to do something you're not willing to do. The fact that he said it like that, not I need you to, but I'm not asking you to, made me want to say yes more than any direct request would have. What do I say? What's my character here? He almost smiled, not quite. Yourself, mostly. Competent, observational, slightly reserved. Curious enough to show up but cautious enough that he has to work for it. He paused. You won't have to perform much. I said I'd do it. He spent the next 2 days briefing me in 40-minute increments. Methodical and thorough. Going over Niall Cavendish's patterns. The specific information he was likely to probe for. The questions I should deflect versus absorb. His COO. A quiet, efficient man named Arthur, who I'd always trusted exactly as much as Sebastian clearly trusted him, walked me through how the monitoring would work, what signal to use if anything felt wrong. On the 3rd evening, after Arthur had gone, and the office floor was empty, I found Sebastian standing at my desk, reading something on my computer screen, which was strictly speaking against every protocol we'd ever established. I cleared my throat. He didn't startle. Arthur's briefing notes, he said, without looking up. I wanted to see what he covered. You could have asked me. I could have. He straightened. In the after-hours quiet, with the overhead fluorescents off, and only the desk lamp running, he looked different. Less architected. How are you finding this? The preparation or the situation, either? The preparation is thorough. The situation is, I thought about it. Strange. I keep thinking about the flowers. How he knew which ones to send, the dahlias. I mentioned them offhandedly to someone at a firm event 8 months ago. That someone apparently spoke to Cavendish at some point after. He filed it away. I shook my head. That's a long game. He's a long game person. Sebastian moved around the desk to stand beside me, looking at the city through the window rather than at me. From this angle I could see the tension in his jaw, the set of his shoulders that I'd learned to read over 2 years of careful attention. He was worried. Not about the situation. He could handle situations. About something more specific. I don't want you in a room with him, he said flatly, to the window. I know. I want you to know that I... He stopped, started again. The logic of this plan is sound. It's clean. It's documentable. It's the fastest route to a result that doesn't require anything I'm not willing to do. I know that, but... His jaw tightened. He turned slightly toward me, and his profile in the lamplight was something I was aware of thinking about too carefully. But I've been in this business for 15 years, and I've never had trouble being purely strategic about a problem until now. The air in the room was not doing what air is supposed to do. Why now? I asked, even though I knew why I was asking. Because the problem involves you. He said it simply, like a fact he'd already accepted even if he hadn't wanted to. Because someone sent you flowers and I spent the rest of that afternoon unable to think about the Finch account. Which has not happened with any work problem in 15 years. Because you've been at this desk for 2 years and 3 months, and somewhere in that time you became... He stopped. His hand moved and then didn't move. Something I'm not prepared to be rational about. I didn't say anything for a moment, then, Sebastian. He looked at me fully then. First time I'd used his name. I'm going to the dinner, I said, not because you've asked me to. Because it's the right move, and I understand the game well enough now to play it. And when it's over, when Cavendish is handled, I turned toward him slightly, the way you turn towards something you've stopped pretending not to see. We're going to have a different conversation about whatever this is. Something in his face shifted, slow and irreversible, like ground settling after pressure releases. That's a condition, it's a fact. He looked at me for a long moment in the lamplight, with the city doing its indifferent thing outside the window. Then he said quietly, "Then let's make sure Tuesday goes cleanly." The restaurant Cavendish chose was in Yorkville. Private, expensive, the kind of place that took its soft lighting seriously. I wore a dark green wrap dress I'd owned for 3 years and never had occasion to justify before. Arthur texted me as the car pulled up. "We're in position. You're doing great," which was kind of him since I hadn't done anything yet. Niall Cavendish stood when I approached the table, and I understood why he'd succeeded at this as long as he had. He was warm in the way that certain professionals are warm, practiced, accurate, convincing. He had the face of someone who'd been told he was trustworthy so many times he'd started to believe it. "Vera, I'm glad you came. I wasn't sure you would." "I'm curious," I said, which was true. "And I'm a grown adult who can meet someone for dinner." He laughed. "Fair enough. What are you drinking?" The first 40 minutes were mostly surface. He asked about my background, my education. I have a finance degree from Queen's, my trajectory into private equity support work. He listened well, which I noted, because it's rarer than people think. He was mapping me, cataloging, and doing it graciously. "You must see a lot working that close to Voss," he said eventually. "Somewhere between the first course and the second. Casual, perfectly casual. He's not exactly a transparent figure. No one in his position is. I've always thought it must be a particular kind of person who chooses to work in that environment. Close to power but not holding it. Seeing everything but speaking carefully." He tilted his head. "Does that describe you? More or less, and does it satisfy you? Seeing everything from the side?" I looked at him. "Why do you ask?" "Because someone with your clarity of mind seems like they'd want more than a supporting role." He said it gently as though it were concern. "You're what, 28? 29? You've been in the same position for over 2 years. That's either deep loyalty or limited options. And I don't think it's the latter." There it was. The first real edge, wrapped in compliment. "I find the work genuinely interesting," I said. "What I have access to is..." I paused as though deciding something. Broad. He repeated the word with quiet interest. "I imagine so. Harrogate touches a lot of industries. A lot of significant relationships." He picked up his wine glass. "Including port financing, if I'm not mistaken. Among many other things. I have some professional history with that sector," he said carefully. "I've found that having the right information, the right context about how relationships between parties are structured, it can completely change the shape of a problem." He set the glass down. "I imagine someone in your position accumulates that kind of context naturally, without even trying." I let the silence sit for a moment. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Cavendish?" He smiled. "I'm suggesting that context is valuable, and that value should be compensated. You're asking me to sell information about my employer's client relationships. I'm asking you to be paid fairly for knowledge you already possess. Think of it as consulting. Informal, discreet, well compensated. He named a number. It was a substantial number, the kind designed to make you question your salary in the middle of a restaurant. In exchange for general guidance on how specific client relationships are structured. Nothing that would harm anyone. Nothing that would harm anyone, I repeated. Exactly. I put my napkin on the table and looked at him steadily. I think we're done for the evening, Mr. Cavendish. The door behind him opened. Two men in suits I didn't recognize, one of them carrying credentials, moved through the room with the calm efficiency of people who'd rehearsed this. Arthur was behind them, and behind Arthur, with his hands in his pockets and an expression that was doing a great deal of controlled work, was Sebastian. Niall Cavendish understood before they'd reached the table. He looked at me with something that wasn't quite betrayal, more like recalibration, the face of a person who'd been playing a game and suddenly realized the board had been different than he thought. You were never considering it, he said. No, I told him. But you've been kind enough to say all of it clearly enough that we don't have to reconstruct anything, so that's useful. They took him through a side exit. The other diners barely registered it. This kind of restaurant had practiced discretion built into its architecture. Arthur came to check on me while the room settled. Clean, he said, which was his equivalent of a standing ovation. Sebastian stood near the window. He'd been watching the exit, and when his eyes came back to me they moved through something, relief, I thought, though on him it looked like a tension releasing rather than an expression. He came across the room to where I was standing. Are you all right? I'm fine. I was fine. Surprisingly so. He was exactly what you said he was. They usually are. He was close enough that I could see the lines of exhaustion he'd been carrying for the past week. You handled it better than I would have. You would have been much less polite, almost certainly. Something in his eyes, carefully. Vera, Sebastian, when I said, he stopped, tried again. The other night in the office. I want to be clear that I wasn't. I know what you were saying. I held his gaze, and I meant what I said. When this is done, we have a conversation. He looked at me for a long moment in the soft, expensive light of this room. We'd turned into a very different kind of venue than it was meant to be. This is done, he said. Then we have a conversation. The formal proceedings took several weeks. Statements, documentation, compliance reviews. Arthur handled most of it with his characteristic quiet efficiency. Cavendish's operation didn't collapse overnight, but the regulatory interests that opened up after that evening created problems he'd spend years managing. Gerald Finch's administrative relationships were firewalled. The firm's client structure was quietly restructured in ways that made it substantially less navigable for people with Cavendish's particular methods. Through it all, Sebastian and I operated exactly as we always had, which is to say with the kind of careful professional rhythm we'd built over 2 years. Except for the things that were different, which were numerous and growing. He left a coffee on my desk one morning, with a sticky note that just said the Kingston file is wrong on page 7, not your fault, Brennan's team, which sounds like nothing, and was, in a Sebastian Voss language that I'd become fluent in over 2 years, essentially a declaration. He started closing his office door less. He walked past my desk in a way that involved slightly more words than it used to. Not a lot, enough. 3 weeks after the Cavendish evening, he stopped in the doorway of his office at 5:45 as I was finishing a transfer summary. The floor was nearly empty. Are you available Sunday, he said, in the same tone he used to ask about document timelines. There's a show at the Ago I've been meaning to see. Apparently, it's best with a second opinion. I looked up. Is that the conversation we said we were having? It's the beginning of it. Then yes, I said. I'm available Sunday. He nodded once, returned to his office, and I stared at my transfer summary for approximately 4 minutes without reading a single number, which had not happened to me in the 2 years I'd worked here. That Sunday at the Ago, we stood in front of an enormous abstract canvas, blues and dark greens layered over each other like depth, and Sebastian said, without any particular preface, I noticed you in the first week, not the way I noticed other employees. Differently. What does that mean? It means that by the end of your second week, I had restructured the security protocol on your email accounts which is something I have never done for anyone who works for me. He kept looking at the painting. And that I told myself it was purely professional, because you had access to sensitive correspondence and it was a reasonable precaution. Was it? The protocol? Yes. The reason I did it? He glanced at me then. Partially. I looked at the painting. When did you stop telling yourself that? When Cavendish sent you dahlias, and I stood in the lobby of this building, wanting to have a very irrational conversation with a florist about her choices. A pause. That's when I understood that I'd been managing something I'd decided not to acknowledge. That's very you, I said. To manage the feeling before addressing it. It's efficient. It's lonely. The words came out quieter than I meant them to. He was quiet for a moment too. Then he turned away from the painting and looked at me directly, the way he looked at problems he'd decided to solve. I don't want to complicate your career, he said. I'm aware of the dynamics. I'm aware that I'm your employer, and that creates an imbalance that isn't fair to you regardless of my intentions. I know. I held his gaze. I also know that I'm the one standing here having this conversation, which is a choice I'm making with full information. I turned to face him properly. I'm not asking you to fix the complexity. I'm asking you to stop managing me out of something we both know is already happening. He looked at me for a long moment, with that expression I'd spent months learning to read. The one that meant he was deciding how honest to be. Then finally, I've been honest with very few people in my professional life, really honest, about what I do, what the edges of it look like, what it costs. He took a breath. I want to be honest with you. I think I've been building to it for 2 years without realizing it. Then be honest with me, I said. Start small if you need to. Something in his face, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one, shifted. The photograph in my desk. The woman on the dock, your mother's mother, I guessed. She died 4 years ago. She was the person who convinced me that building something real was worth the difficulty of doing it right. He looked at the painting again. On bad days, I still look at that photograph because she'd have had something pragmatic and precise to say about whatever was wrong, and usually I can figure out what it would have been. What would she say about this? I asked. He considered it. Probably that I was overthinking it. That I'd already made the decision, and I was just collecting reasons to delay acting on it. He glanced at me sideways. She was frequently right. She sounds like she was. We left the gallery when it closed and walked south on McCall in the particular quiet of a Toronto Sunday in early spring, that specific quality of cold that's already softening, that makes the city feel like it's reconsidering itself. He bought coffee from a shop we passed and handed me one, without asking how I took it. Which was accurate, which meant he'd known for a while. I want to be clear about something, he said, when we were walking again. I intend this to be a real thing, not a situation, not something I can revert back from when it becomes inconvenient. If we're doing this, I'd like to do it with the same commitment I put into the things that matter to me. That's both reassuring and slightly alarming, I said. I know. He glanced at me. I can be difficult. I know you can be difficult. I've spent 2 years across from your office. And you stayed. I stayed. I looked at him. That should tell you something. He stopped walking. We were on a quiet block, a stretch of winter bare maples, and the sound of the streetcar somewhere behind us. And he was looking at me the way he looked at things he'd decided were worth his complete attention, which in 15 years of professional life I suspected was not everything. It tells me quite a lot, he said. And then he kissed me in that particular quiet, somewhere between the AGO and the rest of both our lives. It wasn't seamless after that. Real things aren't. I transitioned out of the assistant role over the following months, partly because Sebastian insisted the optics mattered for me, not for him, and partly because I'd been ready to step into independent consulting work for longer than I'd admitted to myself. I built a client list, slow and careful, while navigating what it meant to be with someone whose professional world I understood better than most people ever would. There were complications. There always were with someone like him. An old regulatory gray area that needed addressing. A former business associate who didn't take well to being phased out. 2 occasions where I had to sit across a dinner table from someone who was smiling at me, while calculating what I knew, and remind myself that I was better at reading rooms than they thought. On those nights I'd call him from wherever I was, or he'd already be calling, because he'd noticed I was quiet, and we'd talk through whatever was happening the way we talked through everything. Directly, with full information, neither of us pretending more simplicity than existed. His grandmother's photograph moved from his desk drawer to the credenza behind his desk, which I noticed and didn't mention. He noticed me noticing and didn't mention it either. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, 14 months after the Cavendish dinner, I was sitting in what had become our apartment. I still found that phrase slightly surreal, even as it settled into ordinary. Reviewing a client contract, the radiator clicking in the way Toronto radiators click from October onward. Sebastien came in with takeout from the Vietnamese place on Spadina that we'd been ordering from since the third week of whatever we were then, and dropped a paper bag on the table and looked at me. With an expression I'd become increasingly fluent in over a year of paying close attention. "You have something to say," I said, without looking up from the contract. "I have a question. Those are different things with you. Sometimes." He sat down across from me, which was something he did when he wanted to be looked at. I looked up. His hands were flat on the table, and the posture I'd learned meant he was containing something he'd decided to stop containing. "I want to marry you." I set down my pen. "Was that the question?" "The question is whether you want to marry me." The statement was independent. I looked at him across the table, this man who'd handed me coffee on a Sunday in early spring, and kissed me on a quiet block of McCall Street, and told me about his grandmother, and slowly, over months, become the person I talked to about everything that mattered, who was difficult and precise and deeply, quietly decent, in a way that I'd been watching from a careful professional distance for 2 years and 3 months before either of us admitted it. "Yes," I said, "conditionally." His mouth twitched. "Of course, conditionally. We keep making decisions together. No unilateral moves on things that affect both of us. You tell me when something is worrying you before it becomes a situation you've already solved without me." Agreed. "And we keep ordering from that place on Spadina at least once a week for the rest of our lives, because I'm not giving that up." This time he actually smiled. Fully. It was still rare enough that it did something to the air in the room. "Agreed," he said. "All of it." I reached across the table and put my hand over his. Outside the window, the October city was doing exactly what Toronto does in October. Gray and golden all at once, halfway between what it was and what it was becoming. The radiator clicked. The takeout was getting cold. He turned his hand over and held mine, and that was that.